welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and this is my second video concluding my exploration of many of the themes in the famous novel by Dan Brown, The Da Vinci Code, looking at Mary Magdalene, the true story of her, whether her and Jesus were married and perhaps even had a bloodline, and how that relates to the mysteries of the Holy Grail. In my last video on this topic, I focused on looking at Mary Magdalene specifically, what the true story is behind her, why she is associated so strongly with the south of France from a historical perspective, some of the alternative views of her that the Gnostics held, and the theory that she was in fact Jesus' wife, and some of the backing for that, and some of the esoteric mysteries that are related to that. So that if you haven't seen that video already, I would recommend that you look at that one before watching this one. I'll leave a link in the description below. And so that video covered, a lot of ground from pretty much the time of Jesus until 1,000 years after that, and maybe a little bit of the history in before Christ in that time, and some of the things that might have influenced Jesus in surprising ways, going back to Egypt and Babylon and all that sort of thing. And so tonight, I'm going to pick up where that last video left off. We've established the hidden meaning of the Magdalene, the presence of the sacred feminine in Western spirituality, how that keeps resurfacing at various times, particularly in the south of France, how it could be related to a bloodline. And we're going to explore that in this video, and whether there's any truth to that claim, first put forward in Holy Blood, Holy Grail. I've got my copy here. And how all of these ideas relate to the Holy Grail, that coveted spiritual relic that has fascinated the minds of so many esotericists over the centuries, myself included at one point. So we're going to explore all of that tonight, and what a fascinating quest it's going to be. To begin with, let's go back to the south of France, where there's the cult of the Magdalene has taken root well and truly by this point among the people of the south of France, otherwise known as the Languedoc or Septimania. The very same Mary Magdalene who is associated with alternative and subversive forms of Christianity in the early centuries of the Christian era. Now, in the 1100s, through to the 1300s, we see the emergence of the Cathars. The Cathars were active in southern France in particular in that 200-300 year period, as well as in northern Italy. And when this Cathar heresy, as it came to be known, became established in the south of France, it became a powerful competitor to the Nicene Christianity that was dominant in much of Europe. So who were these Cathars and what did they believe? Well, the Cathars were a type of alternative Christianity, a more mystical form of Christianity, sometimes associated with Gnosticism, and very similar to the Gnostics in many respects. They followed a dualist cosmology, for example, very similar to that of the Gnostics, with a true and false God and the physical world being seen as a prison for souls. And so they were similar to the Valentinians, who I spoke about in the last video on this topic. And like the Valentinians, they may have also believed in reincarnation or the transmigration of souls. Many Cathars lived ordinary lives. However, there were an elect among the Cathars, the sort of spiritual leaders of the community, who are known as the perfecti, who lived pure lives. They had taken a vow of chastity and poverty, and were living off a pescatarian diet. And that's about as much as we can really be certain of when it comes to the Cathars. The evidence about what they really believed was scant, because a lot of that information was destroyed. And a lot of the evidence that we have about what the Cathars believed is actually from anti-heretical interrogations that were carried out by members of the Catholic Church. So we have found out information about heresies that did turn out to be true that way, but obviously, as the witch trials have taught us, and the history of the Inquisition has taught us, often, you can have an interrogator who has their own paranoid ideas about what they're trying to prove and asks some leading questions, and the person who's on the rack will say just about anything. So the information that you get from that technique for extracting people's beliefs is far from reliable. But unfortunately, it's almost all that we have to go on. So it's not fully clear what the Cathars would have believed, but we're pretty certain that they were dualists. And whether it was because they were taking on the things that they were accused of as an act of rebellion against the church later on, or whether they were a continuation of a previous Gnostic sect, such as the Bogomils, who had very similar beliefs to what the Cathars were believed to have thought. We know that they're very dualist and very Gnostic type ideas that they had. And we know that they had much more equality between men and women versus in the hierarchy of the church that was very male oriented, obviously. And it's not clear whether there was like an organized heresy where there was like a united, agreed upon set of ideas that was Catharism. There might have been a plurality of ideas, and there might have been all kinds of heresy going on in the septimania of those days, because it was a very free and open kind of society compared to the rest of Europe, which was monolithically under the control of the church by this point. But we can get some idea. We do have the Book of the Two Principles, which was written by a Cathar in their own words, in his own words, about what they believed, and it does appear to mirror much of the core beliefs of the Bogomils very closely. We know that there was a copy of another text known as the Secret Supper that was in the Inquisition records at Carcassonne in southern France, and had been marked as a book that the Cathars followed. And among the beliefs that the Cathars were supposed to have followed, according to the records of the inquisitorial interrogations of Cathars, one belief that they were said to have held was that there was like a spiritual Christ and then an earthly Jesus, and the earthly man was evil and sinful, and he had a concubine who was Mary Magdalene. So there does seem to be some sensationalizing going on there. It sounds like a kind of a distortion of the Gnostic idea that perhaps the physical Jesus was separate from the spiritual being who was Christ, who perhaps overshadowed Jesus at a time. And it's very reminiscent of the Gnostic idea that the flesh or the material world is inherently evil in some way. The Cathars, from what we can go on, from what we know about what they believe, they certainly wouldn't have expected that Jesus or Christ, or however you want to frame it, they certainly wouldn't have expected their Christ to have a carnal relationship with anyone. But perhaps there was some understanding of the special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Who knows? Who knows? It's just interesting that there is this acknowledgement of like the special role of Mary in Jesus' life that seems to have come through in some way. And they did have more equality between men and women. There could be women who could be perfecti. There were women who could be preachers, unlike in the Catholic Church. And interestingly, there may have also been a Cathar belief that God had two female consorts, Kulam and Hulabam. Again, this is according to anti-heretical accounts, so it might not be completely true, but there's at least the possibility that the Cathars had this idea of the divine feminine. And if they were, in fact, influenced by earlier forms of Gnosticism, this would not be beyond the pale, because, of course, Sophia featured heavily in some early forms of Gnosticism as a kind of divine feminine figure. This all gives us some food for thought. If the Cathars were really a continuation of some earlier form of Gnosticism, and they seem to have carried on some Valentinian beliefs in their own beliefs, is it possible that the ideas that the Valentinians had about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the nature of their relationship somehow filtered down into those beliefs as well? Possible, but the surviving evidence is tenuous. The Cathars were brutally suppressed eventually, and the people were massacred by the Albigensian Crusade. The Cathars were subjected to grueling tortures and publicly executed by burning at the stake. But their return was prophesied. So in 1321, the last of the Cathar perfecti, Guillaume Bellebaste, was burnt at the stake. But before he passed, he proclaimed that in 700 years, the laurel will become green again, and good men and women will return. Good men and women is what Cathars referred to themselves as the followers of the true Christianity, rather than the false form of that religion as embodied in the mainstream church. And did you pick up on it? 1321. If you count forward 700 years, that's the time we're living in now. So, just some food for thought. This is very interesting times to be living in, and much has been foretold about these times by many different types of people, and this is another example of that. Are we on the verge of a great awakening? I certainly think we are, and this is more evidence to support that. And are we on the verge of returning to a purer, more mystical understanding of Christ? I believe that we are. But just because the Cathars were suppressed by the church does not mean that their influence did not live on. There are some who believe that the influence of the Cathars in fact lived on in the troubadours, sort of travelling poets and musicians that went throughout the courts of Europe, who came out of the south of France, the same region that the Cathars came from, the same region as the cult of the Magdalene, really took root. In particular, the troubadours introduced the concept of a refined form of love, or courtly love, between a knight and his maiden. So, rather than just giving in to desire, there was a prolonging of the longing for the other, and redirecting that energy towards more sublime pursuits, more spiritual pursuits, and then the fair maiden becoming the muse for spiritual growth. It was like a sublimation of that energy from something that was very carnal to something that was spiritual, which is very reminiscent of the way that the sacrament of the bridal chamber is talked about in the Gospel of Philip, one of the main Gnostic texts that really elevates Mary Magdalene. And the status of women was elevated in the south of France as well in those days. And one of the influences on this was the Albigensian heretics, the Cathars, affording women equal status to men in certain respects, and perhaps having their own ideas about the divine feminine or sacred feminine, perhaps linked to Mary Magdalene. But either way, we do see the same spirit appearing as existed in the days of the Gnostics, with their alternative history of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and the elevated spiritual relationship that they had. And then the ideas of the troubadours, including, perhaps particularly, that of courtly love, then went on to inspire the early development of the legend of the Holy Grail, this legend that has fascinated so many over the centuries. Now, there were other influences on the legend of the Holy Grail, particularly Celtic legends about Bran the Blessed and the Cauldron of Plenty that came from Celtic paganism. And you know, the Grail story was related to Arthurian legend, again, had strong roots in Celtic pre-Christian mythology. And Christianity and Christian themes were introduced more overtly later into the Grail legend. And this is how this legend eventually developed. So the original Grail story came from Chrétien de Troyes, and it got developed by later authors, such as Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Essenbach. And the story of the Holy Grail is the story of Percival. So Percival was a simple boy who lived in the forest with his mother and dreamed of becoming a knight, much to his mother's dismay. And then one day he decided to go and become a knight and pursue his dream. Went to the court of King Arthur, became a knight. Then he saves a damsel in distress, Blanchefleur, name meaning white flower, and they hit it off romantically. But then duty calls and he needs to return to his mother to check on her in the forest. He leaves his lover and goes back towards the forest. And on his way, he comes across a castle, a mysterious castle, where the Fisher King resides, this mysterious king who invites Percival to a banquet where he's shown a number of different objects, including the Grail. But Percival fails to inquire about the Grail, and because he fails to do so, the Fisher King, who has a wound in his thigh, remains wounded, and his land remains barren. And in later versions of the legend, Percival has to return to the Fisher King and inquire about the Grail, and then the Fisher King is healed, and the land is healed as a result, and Percival becomes the new custodian of the Grail. And throughout the story, on this spiritual quest for the unattainable that Percival is on, his Blanche Fleur serves as a muse to inspire him to greater and greater spiritual heights. And that delayed pleasure is something that he uses to better himself, to be more worthy of his maiden. And that is the Grail legend in a nutshell. The motive of the Fisher King is particularly interesting because you have a wounded king who is healed, and then that heals the land, much like the story of Isis and Osiris, much like the story of Tammuz and Ishtar in the Hieros Gamos rite of the ancient Near East, where the restoration of the virility of the king is the thing that restores the land. Whether that parallel was intentional or not is another story, but there do seem to be the same themes appearing again and again. The use of the cup as a symbol for the Grail, which in later versions of the legend was said to be either the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper or the cup that was used to collect his blood on the cross. But here's another thing where we need to look a bit more closely at the legend before we start to conflate too many different things and finding too many connections that maybe aren't there, because the Grail was not always considered a cup. The earliest version of the Grail appears to have been a serving tray, which was later reimagined as a cup as the legend was more Christianized in the later versions. But this word Grail is probably etymologically related to the Latin gradalis, which described a kind of deep bowl or dish rather than a cup. And so the later division of the word sangreal into sang-rael or royal blood does not match with the true etymological origins of the word. So that throws a bit of a spanner in the works for the whole Da Vinci Code theory, that Mary Magdalene was the Grail because she carried the royal blood and her womb represented the chalice, which is the Grail. But that's historical fact. But we're dealing with spiritual mysteries here, so there is a level to this which is highly symbolic. And part of the spiritual meaning of certain things can be gleaned from looking at correspondences. And I think that if you look at the Grail and the associations that the Grail has, there has been a legitimate association with the cup of Christ. And the cup is a well-established symbol for the womb and the divine feminine in Western esotericism. So none of this is to say that Mary Magdalene doesn't deserve to be associated with the Grail, because I would argue that the correct correspondences are there to make that association on a spiritual level, on a symbolic level, even if the history of the idea of the Grail didn't quite develop in the way that the Da Vinci Code would have us believe. And she is an embodiment of the very archetype who appears in the Grail legend as the fair, noble lady who inspires the knight to win the prize of the Grail, representing spiritual purity, and the bridal chamber becoming a place of sacramental union rather than just physical union, and somewhere where that is associated with the quest for the union with the divine. So there were certainly some threads that were running through and connecting the Grail legend and the Troubadours and the Cathars and Mary Magdalene. Whether all the connections that have been presented as being there really are there is another question. We certainly are seeing some very similar spiritual themes surfacing and then resurfacing throughout history. a hidden side to Christianity that is struggling to assert itself and being labelled as a heresy and suppressed again, only to resurface another day. So that deals with that side of the assertions that were made in the Da Vinci Code. But what about the bloodline? This is perhaps the most intriguing idea that was put forth first in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and then later picked up by the Da Vinci Code, that not only did Jesus and Mary Magdalene marry, but they had at least one child, and from that child came a bloodline. And that bloodline was in France, where Mary Magdalene arrived by boat, and the bloodline intermarried with other French nobles, and that became the Merovingian dynasty. And then the Priory of Sion, a powerful secret society, was formed to guard and protect the bloodline. And this same Priory of Sion that was protecting the bloodline had plans to reveal the explosive secret of the existence of the bloodline to the world when the time was right. But is there any truth to this story? Let's have a look. I'm not going to go too much into the Priory of Sion because that is a very, very murky topic, and there's a lot of hoaxing and forgery and shenanigans going on there that I'm not going to unpick in this video. And I don't think that ultimately it gets to the core issues and the core questions that need to be answered. So we'll put that to one side. Is there a bloodline? Let's consider that. If Mary Magdalene really did go to France and she really did have a child with Jesus, then that would suggest, provided that her descendants survived, that would suggest the continuation of a bloodline. Again, as I have said in my previous video on this topic, it's a big maybe on all of those questions. But perhaps it's possible, theoretically. But if there was a Jesus and Mary bloodline, I think that the whereabouts of the descendants of that bloodline today would be, on the available evidence, lost to history. Now, in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, it does put forward the premise that the Merovingians were the continuation of that bloodline. However, this story about the Merovingians coming from this Jesus bloodline is a modern fabrication. It's not something that appears earlier in history. It's not something that the Merovingian kings originally claimed about themselves. In Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the authors talk about how they came up with this theory, and it doesn't have very solid grounding at all. So basically, they knew that the first Merovingian was said to have been born from a fish type of being, and they were kind of joking, there's something fishy about the Merovingians. You know, what is it about the Merovingians that's so important? And then they thought about how Jesus was represented by a fish in early Christianity, and aha, the fish is a symbol for Jesus. The Merovingians come from Jesus. So that is a huge leap, as you can see. But that is the whole basis of why we now today believe that the Merovingians are descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So I don't think that that is a reliable theory at all. And another thing that was a bit sneaky that the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail did is they took other stories about real bloodlines that come from the Davidic line that existed in the south of France and the surrounding regions, and they tried to make some kind of connection about how that was really talking about the Merovingians or their descendants in the Counts of Toulouse or something like that. For example, there is a very well-established story from the south of France about a figure known as Macaire of Narbonne, who was a Jewish spiritual teacher from the Babylonian Exilarch community. Now, this was a community that existed in modern-day Iraq, which was the leftovers of the Babylonian exile when the first temple was destroyed and the Jews were exiled into Babylon. And this community existed right up until like 1000 AD-ish, and maintained that the spiritual leaders, the rabbis that led that community, were direct descendants of King David. And so there's a story that Charlemagne, to help cement his power in the south of France when he was pushing against the Moors in Spain, he wanted to win over the Jews of southern France. He wanted to bring over a great scholar from the line of David to rule over the Jews of Narbonne. And this figure was the legendary Marquis of Narbonne, who really represented some of the Babylonian exilarchs that started to arrive in that part of Europe as their fortune turned for the worse over in the Middle East. And so this Marquis, he and his descendants held prominent positions within the Jewish community, both of Septimania and in the Sephardic community of Spain across the border, with whom they intermingled regularly. And the descendants of Marquis of Narbonne, or the Babylonian exilarchs, more broadly, bore the title Nazi, meaning prince. So this is a very real bloodline that traces all the way back to King David that really did exist in that region, which has been used to reinforce the bogus Merovingian myth. And that wasn't the only messianic bloodline that existed in the region. So I mentioned the Sephardic Jews in Spain. That entire community considered themselves to be the descendants of King David, who had come over to Spain after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And they were the ones who lived in Jerusalem. That's where all the aristocracy lived, the ones who were, from the royal line of Judah. And so that is where the original Sephardic Jews claim to have come from. So we see that there's at least two established legends of a messianic bloodline in that very region of Europe. But it had nothing to do with Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and it had nothing to do with the Merovingians. But we see echoes of this history as well, perhaps in something like the legend of the Holy Grail, when you consider that the Fisher King was connected to Joseph of Arimathea, who was, by extension, a member of the Davidic line as well. But from what I've said so far, it's not looking good for the bloodline story. There doesn't seem to be, there's perhaps it could have happened, perhaps, but there's not really very strong evidence that it really did happen. And that was where I sort of arrived the last time that I looked into this story. Then, more recently, when I've looked into this issue, I've looked more closely at the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau, and there has been some stuff that I've seen from that which has made me reconsider whether I should take the possibility of a Jesus Mary Magdalene bloodline more seriously. And I'll explain why. So first of all, let's look at this other legend associated with the south of France, the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau. Rennes-le-Chateau is a commune in France, and it came to fame because in 1885 a new priest was appointed for the commune known as Berenger Saunier, and within the church of the commune dedicated to Mary Magdalene, funnily enough, Saunier stumbled across some great secret, perhaps to do with some parchments that he found or some other treasure, which suddenly made him very rich. And this gave rise to the rumour that Saunier was using the secret he had discovered at Rennes-le-Chateau to blackmail the church. That's how explosive it must have been. But what secret could he have discovered that is of that nature? The documents he supposedly found relating to Dagobert II, who was a Merovingian king, were later found to be forgeries by the Priory of Sion, trying to connect themselves to the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau to add weight to their own claims that Pierre Plantard had some connection to the Merovingian kings to try and re-establish the monarchy in France and do some kind of weird stuff there. So that's been shown to be bogus. But much of the hype around the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau is the doing of the Priory of Sion, who appear to have only existed since the 50s, at least on paper. There have been claims that they go back to the Templars and all of that. I don't know what the truth is. Again, there do seem to be some things, some knowledge that they're holding on to, which does seem to point to something legitimate. But there's just so much bogus stuff in there. But there does seem to be some dangerous knowledge connected to Rennes-le-Chateau, which the Priory of Sion, whatever the heck that organisation really is, seems to be in on to some degree. The reason why we can know this is because there's a bunch of mysterious deaths that happen around the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery. So when Berenger Saunier passed away, his estate passed to his housekeeper, Marie Denarnaud. And then later in her life, she was preparing to disclose the secrets of Rennes-le-Chateau, which apparently she knew. And just before she was preparing to do that, she suffered a debilitating stroke that made her unable to speak for the rest of her life, or have very great difficulty speaking. And she's said to have taken the secret to her grave. Very convenient timing for that stroke to happen, and it's not the first time that we see a stroke or cerebral hemorrhage popping up. So after Marie, the estate passed to Noel Corbu, who was a business owner, who turned it into a hotel. And at various times he hinted that he might know something about the mystery of Rennes. Whether that was all bluster or not is anybody's guess. But in 1965, he did pass away in a freak car accident. So it certainly came across like somebody was protecting something. And at this point, you might say it could all be coincidence, but then there's more. So there is a document in the archives in Paris on the Priory of Sion titled Le Serpent Rouge, or the Red Serpent, that is related to the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau. This document mentions Jesus as well as Mary Magdalene. It calls Mary Magdalene Isis. Interesting given what I said about Mary Magdalene in the previous video on this topic. And it also refers to Mary Magdalene as a queen of a lost kingdom. And it also makes cryptic references to Et in Arcadia Ego and other artworks, which are probably references to the countryside around Rennes-le-Chateau. The document also mentions a new Temple of Solomon associated with the secret places of this queen. There are also references to ancestral lines and a voice of the blood. And so there's some very provocative hints there at a mystery to be solved, and you can guess at the nature of the mystery. That document was submitted to the French National Library on the 17th of January 1967, and on the 6th and 7th of March 1967, all three men who were named as authors of the document were found hanged. All three. They weren't necessarily the true authors, but they were the ones who were named, and then they wind up unalived. So that's very suspicious. And again, it goes back to Rennes-le-Chateau and what is the secret that is really buried there. There were also some mysterious deaths associated with the filming of the 2008 documentary Bloodline, where people passed away just as they were about to provide information on the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. One of these was Lord Lichfield, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage. We've heard that before, haven't we? And then there was also an associate of the treasure hunter that featured in the film who had some information on the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau and never got to come back to France to provide it. So to me, this is a clear trail. It's as if all these people had been friends with the Clintons. To me, there's more than just coincidence unfolding here. There's a clear pattern of people losing their lives because of things that they know. But what secret could be so dangerous that people have been unalived for knowing it? And is it related to a bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene? Well, everything that I've provided so far is very cryptic, and it's hard to understand what the truth is. To help us get closer to the answer, fortunately, Saunier left us clues in the symbolism of the church at Rennes-le-Chateau, which he made extensive renovations to after he found out this secret. In particular, there is a bas-relief on the altar of the church, at the front of the church, which depicts Mary Magdalene in a very odd fashion. This is the bas-relief, and there's a few things that immediately stand out. For one thing, Mary Magdalene has a red stomach. The area of her stomach is a different shade of red to her garments, very similar to the way that pregnancy is represented in medieval artwork, such as the Maria Gravida paintings and the Madonna del Parto paintings. The Madonna del Parto paintings also feature a book which Mary, the Mother of Christ, is reading. We have a book here. And we also see the cross that Mary Magdalene is praying to, which is a prominent symbol of Mary Magdalene in iconography, together with a skull. But what's unusual with this cross is that there seem to be shoots flowering off of it. And if you look at the symbolism of other figures, such as the legend of Joseph and Aaron in the Old Testament, the flowering of a rod represents the descendants of a particular man, whose rod that is. And a rod that is a crucifix can only refer to one man. And then in the background of the bas-relief in the mountains, we see a hidden JM, which has been speculated as meaning Jesus and Mary. But to me, this symbolism is very overt, and it's very difficult to read it in any other way than Mary Magdalene is pregnant, and she is pregnant with the child of Jesus. There's no other interpretation of this relief in my mind. So to me, that is the thing, that it seems to be a very strong hint that this is the secret of Rennes-le-Chateau. And this is the thing, if it was just an elaborate hoax, that would be one thing, but people have lost their lives for this mystery. So to me, this has really made me rethink the veracity of the bloodline theory. It's probably going to haunt me for a while, and it's not definitive proof, but again, it's highly suggestive. But I just want to conclude on one other thing, which is, all right, so if there is a bloodline from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, so what? In the 21st century, who gives a rat's about bloodlines anyway, and what they might entitle a person to? Well, for one thing, if there was really a bloodline, then virtually everyone of European descent could be traced back to it by now. There's been some research into Charlemagne, who lived over 1,000 years ago, and that research has shown that, yeah, virtually everybody in Europe would be a descendant of Charlemagne by now. So imagine going back 2,000 years in European history. And maybe that helps us feel closer to Jesus, to know that perhaps we all have some of his blood running through our veins. But again, I think that's missing the point. Because what's more important than any bloodline is the lost teachings of Christianity that are connected to Mary Magdalene. Margaret Starbird makes this observation in The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, and I tend to agree with her. And that lost teaching is the sacrament of the bridal chamber, the hieroskamos, the longing of the Grail Knight for his lady. In other words, the mysteries of sacred sexuality. And we see this prudishness in mainstream Christianity, a aversion and a disgust towards the physical union of man and woman, and a devaluation of the conjugal relationship, and a devaluation in particular of the feminine principle, whereas the masculine and the feminine should complement one another. In religions where there's priests and priestesses, that it is much more apparent. So instead of making women priests, why not just bring back priestesses? That might be a solution to the church's present gender problems. But they're going to have to, if they do that, they're going to have to discount St. Paul, because St. Paul had a very negative view of women. Another thing that St. Paul has done to just really mess with the legacy of Christ. Thanks again, Paul. And it is unusual that if Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, that there's no mention of such a marriage. But if the apostolic leadership of the church were really that threatened by Mary Magdalene, as is presented in, say, the Gospel of Philip, then it makes sense that they would have gone to great pains to omit her from the story as much as they reasonably could. And then the Gnostics wouldn't necessarily be much better in talking about the true extent of the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, because the Gnostics were very down on physical relations between men and women. So if there was anything more than a pure kind of platonic spiritual marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, they wouldn't talk about it in their Gospels. So the true nature of the relationship may be lost to time. But some version of the mystery, I would argue, was definitely practiced by Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Some version of the sacrament of the bridal chamber. I think that, more than the existence of any bloodline or this or that, can be proven. And there's echoes of it, whether by direct connection or not, or just resonance at a soul level through later things like the Grail legend and the Troubadours, and the modern obsession with Mary Magdalene as well. And with the rediscovery of more and more Gnostic texts over the last 130 years, and the release of the intellectual stranglehold that the church used to have on Western civilization, we're starting to rekindle our understanding of that lost legacy. And so that's exciting. And it's going to enrich our understanding of Western religion. It's going to enrich our understanding of Western esotericism. But it's very important to go through these legends very carefully and find truth from fiction, from things that might be true but don't have as much evidence as we would like, because otherwise we can be misled. So I certainly think that it's a fascinating story that was put forward by the Da Vinci Code, and I've tried to outline the bits of it that make us think the most and what that can bring to us as spiritual seekers. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit join or thanks to support me further. I am currently promoting a book of channeled angelic messages that I've published recently, which includes stuff on the lost teachings of Jesus. So I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And I also encourage you to join my mailing list. Again, I'll leave a link to that in the description below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.